Empezar, por favor. Buenos días, buenas tardes, buenas
Good
noches.
morning, good afternoon, and good evening to everyone. We are going to begin one more session in our process in this program, and I want to give everyone a warm welcome, as always. And before getting into our agenda today, we would like to have a volunteer this morning who would like to guide this space of reflection and opening and invocation this morning. In any form of invocation or prayer that you might already practice. So let's see if any of the participants would like to volunteer to do the invocation today. Among those who are here this morning, who would like to do an invocation? Any participant from Asia, Africa, or Latin America? Any volunteer this morning?
Bueno.
Hortensia Doris tiene la mano levantada.
Ya, gracias, ahorita estoy.
Or Doris has her hand up. Go ahead. Thank you, Doris. Thank you. We will give the floor over to Doris. Go ahead.
Good morning, good evening, good afternoon, classmates and teachers. For our invocation today, I would just like to share a simple poem that I made earlier, inspired by the recent field work we did in the mountains of the northern Philippines and the priceless lessons that we discussed with our wonderful teachers and speakers here in the school. I hope this poem would be able to remind us a bit of the essence, our essence as women, specifically as Indigenous women. Here is the poem. I am earth, wind, and sky. I am the flutter in your wings and the soul that tries to sing. I am river, grass, and flowers bloom. I am the whisper of love, the shadow of your smile. I am the shore that cuddles the sand and the rain that cleanses the land. I am moon and I am sunshine. I am the fount of youthful daydreams and the end of your sigh when the morning murmurs high. I am mother, daughter, sister, and grandma. I am hellish ice and winter fire, the answer to your longings and the nightmare that screams. I am child, I am woman, I am alive. So that's a simple poem that I made earlier. Thank you.
Thank you, Doris. This is a beautiful result of an inspiration. We don't always take the time to do that. We can be inspired, but we don't always take the time to write. And thank you so much, Doris, for your beautiful words and thoughts and reflections. And we want to continue to invite everyone to write our reflections, our poems. Thank you very much, Doris. So now we have begun our agenda for today. We are grateful always to life and the opportunity that we have to gather together this morning. So we're opening up borders and we are unified one with another in this space that FEMI has provided. So today on our agenda, we're talking about a very important issue, and we hope that everyone can strengthen our knowledge in this area. We know some about it, but we need to continue learning. So today, we're going to have the opportunity to have Joanis Amador as a guest today. She's a member of the FEMI team, and she has the role of the coordinator of the Semilla project, as well as the IPAF fund and INI, the INI fund from FEMI. She will share with us this morning some advocacy areas that FEMI is involved in that involves lobbying, and she's going to talk about what she has learned from this program. So thank you, Johannes, for being with us this morning and for sharing your experiences. Johannes is from Colombia, and we're looking forward to your presentation. Thank you once again, and you have the floor. Welcome, Johannes. Thank you, Hortensia. It's a pleasure to see you again. Thank you to all of the members of the school for inviting me here. Good morning, good afternoon, and good evening to everyone. I also want to share, thank our sister Doris for her beautiful poem. My name, as Hortensia has said, is Joanis Amador. I'm a Senu Indigenous woman from Colombia, and I've been working for over 12 years as the coordinator of the Semillas project in the INI project. So right now, I want to share with you a little bit about the work that we do in these two mechanisms, and to share a little bit with you about the INI fund and how it began. But I wonder, Hortensia, if you can tell us how you'd like to do this. Would you like me to go ahead and speak and then handle questions at the end, or should we ask questions along the way? Well, you should feel free to use the methodology that you prefer. If you think it's better to try to do a dialogue or to take questions along the way as you present, that's fine. Or if you want to do your presentation first, that's fine as well. Feel free to coordinate it. And we just want to invite all the participants to think about your questions and create a dialogue, because this is an opportunity to learn more about these issues. So time is yours, and we have approximately 50 minutes of presentation, and then another half hour for questions and answers. But if you'd like to take questions and answers along the way, that's fine as well. Go ahead, Johannes. Okay. Well, I think we can leave both options, right? We can have a time for questions and answers at the end, but feel free to interrupt the presentation as well, because I'm going to be talking about a number of things. And so it might be that you need to ask the question in the moment. So feel free to ask them in the moment as well. I'm going to share my screen here. So I imagine that you've already talked about what FEMI is. It's a global mechanism that it covers the 3 regions. It has 4 programs. And one of those programs is the Global Women's Leadership School, where you're participating currently. And there's also a program for participation in political science, a research program on topics of impact. And we have a program also, which is the Indigenous Women's Fund, INI, and that's the philanthropical arm of FEMI. We recognize the knowledge and local practices as a basis for sustainability for community projects. In 2010, 2011, we decided from FEMI that it was important to be able to have a word that would represent the fund for Indigenous women. And we decided to put out a call for an Indigenous word that would help describe the fund. And at this point, there was a Peruvian friend who put out the word Aini. It's a Quechua word from South America, from the country of Peru. And the word Aini basically talks about reciprocity, solidarity, and equitable joint work for justice among human beings and other beings. So it encapsulates all of that. This is the first and only fund that has been directed for and from Indigenous women to direct financial and material resources. With this fund, what we hope to do, what we try to do, is that it not be a fund just limited to giving money or donations, grants. We want to do more than that. We want to be a different fund from all the other funds that exist, where money is given and okay, we've given money, and then after a while you lose contact with the organization. So if any of your organizations have been funded by INI, you'll realize that what we do is that we go beyond that. In addition to financial support that we provide, if the organization has presented and implemented an innovated proposal according to the INI criteria, what we do is we take it up to a second level. And often we identify a significant leadership, and what we try to do is to take that leader to different places, different events. And we recommend also that group to other donors. If you're working on this topic, you might want to go with this donor, and you might be able to become a beneficiary there. So the INI Fund is directed at Indigenous women from Indigenous communities and organizations. And we're trying to strengthen individual and collective rights, as well as to build on good life for Indigenous people. In the INI Fund, the INI Fund began with just one mechanism, which was the Semillas project, or the seed projects, where we gave a maximum of $5,000 to different projects. I remember that in the first call that we made, we had to stay, we were open for about 3 months, and there were like 1,000 proposals in a bunch of different languages, and I was the only one working on the INI Fund at the time. I had to review all of these proposals in 3 languages, which was very difficult because there were I could only choose 12 out of the more than 1,000 proposals that came in from the different regions. But now INI Fund has grown quite a bit, Now we have three mechanisms. We have the Semilla scaling plan, where we support grassroots organizations. And these grassroots organizations who perhaps have never received funding from an outside group before, maybe they don't have legal status. Often foundations will require you to have some sort of legal status as a community organization or association. And so if you don't have that status, it's hard to get money. But in the Semilla project, we identify Indigenous women who are organized, and we help them to get a fiscal sponsor to be able to obtain access to funds. We also have the IPAF project, and IPAF is a mechanism, IPAF, which is not exactly a FEMI mechanism, but we work on it as an implementing partner for Latin America for these resources. And then we also have the LDS program, which is Leading from the South. It's a much larger program. And the grants happen at three levels, at small, medium, and large organizations. And the maximum amount given there from the LDS fund can be more than $100,000. So it can be a significant amount of money. But there are also other amounts that are given to small organizations, like 20,000. A medium-sized organization might receive a grant of 60,000. It's variable. Here we have the three mechanisms. We have the Semillas project. That's where we really try to focus on grassroots organizations. We have the Fund for Support of Indigenous Peoples, which is IPAF, and we have that supports Indigenous peoples and organizations by financing small projects that improve the access for Indigenous peoples trying to access decision-making processes. That's sponsored by the International Fund for Agricultural Development, FIDA, which is a fund from the United Nations. It gives loans to countries, and it has within their program this small program which has to do with funds for Indigenous peoples. As I said, it's not directly a FEMI program, but FEMI acts as an implementing partner for Latin America for these funds. And this is a fund that is given to mixed organizations, not necessarily grassroots organizations. And so they're trying to reach Indigenous communities, whether they be women's organizations or mixed organizations. And we also have the Leading from the South program, LDS, that promotes reflections and collective actions, learning and building of networks of solidarity between countries and regions to bring to the table the voices and experiences of Indigenous women. This is financed by the Foreign Ministry of the Netherlands. So co-investment is something that we talk about in the INE fund, and that's very important because, as I was saying, we want to be a very different fund from all the other funds. For example, one of the reasons that Indigenous peoples and Indigenous women can't access resources is because often they don't have resources to start with. And so in our first calls for proposals, we always said that it was important that organizations would provide at least 20% of the amount of money that they were asking for. And so a lot of organizations said, well, we can't do that because they're organizations who were perhaps applying for funds for the very first time. So they didn't have the 20%. So at INE, we said, well, if the organizations can't access resources, and we're trying to reach these grassroots communities, how are we going to help them to access funds? because they don't have those counterpart funds. And so what we did was to give a monetary value to everything that women do in our communities. And sometimes we think there's no monetary value to it. For example, every day in our communities, women are working for the community. We have our communal houses, we have indigenous houses. In my region, we call them indigenous houses. And we're constantly having meetings. If we have more than one language, we're constantly translating or interpreting. And so we said that this is a contribution. And so if you don't have 20% in funds, you can give in-kind contribution by placing a monetary value on the work that we do every day in our communities. And we realize that what we do actually does have monetary value. In addition, we were saying that in their budgets, they should think about in-kind participation when they apply for other funds from other donors, and that they should say every day we are working and we don't talk about the value added that we're providing. So from the INE fund, we try to really support these processes. And I think it's been really valuable because we ourselves, as an organization, have learned quite a bit. And the women who receive the funds have learned to give monetary value to the work that they already do, that money isn't the only important thing, and that you might be able to have access to other grants with the same. You can say, we have the resources of language, we have the place already where we're going to be carrying out these activities. All of these are contributions in kind that community organizations can learn in order to access funding without having counterpart funding in money. And another thing we try to do is to strengthen institutions and provide economic support. These are, economic empowerment. In general, we try to make sure that the organizations can make decisions about what specific areas they're going to work on. Currently, we've added some new specific areas like art, culture, and sports for empowerment, and that's been a really great process to see how culture, arts, and sports communities can strengthen the idea of the rights of women, Indigenous women. And now, after this general context of INE and our three mechanisms, now we are focusing on the IPAF, which is the Fund for Indigenous People Support Fund. These are, there's three indigenous organizations selected by FIDA and the Administrative Council of IPAF, and the International Indigenous Women's Fund, FEMI, is the counterpart for the Latin American Caribbean region. And in this region of Latin America, FEMI is the implementing organization for these projects. In Asia and Africa, there are other organizations who are implementing partners. So it's important that if you're from these other regions, that you learn about these other grant mechanisms where you can participate and request funds. For example, in Asia, there's a place called Teva. In Africa, there's an organization called Samburu. So take note of that, because these are calls for proposals that happen every cycle. Ours is every 4 years, and currently we're in the 4th cycle of the alliance between FIDA and FIMI, but we're going to have a 6th cycle soon. You might be asking yourself, why did FIDA decide to decentralize its resources? As I was saying, since FIDA is a UN organization, it's a big fund that loans money. It's the International Fund for Agricultural Development. In English, it's IFAD, and it has 168 member states and operates on 5 continents. And FIDA, the International Fund for Agricultural Development, is a UN fund. It's a large fund that loans money to various countries. I don't know if you have heard of the COSOPs in your country. These are, well, the countries lend money to this fund, and then those resources go out to various countries, and each country has the autonomous decision-making power about where and when they're going to invest this money. It has to be for agricultural matters, but these resources are not given out by or are not donations. They are loans that the countries then have to pay back to this fund. So FIDA, or IFAD in English, within its own structure of policies, has a support fund for indigenous peoples, and that is support for small projects. For example, per cycle, they might support 11 or 12 projects, and the largest amount of money that you can receive is $50,000. So IFAD empowers the rural population by improving access to natural resources, improved agricultural technology and production services, financial services, markets, non-agricultural employment and business development, and local national programs and policies and processes. IPAF, the Indigenous People Support Fund, is a program of the International Agricultural Development Fund, and their objective is to strengthen Indigenous peoples' communities and their organizations by funding micro projects, small projects. So the smallest amount is 20,000 and the largest amount is 50,000. But for these calls for proposals, there's something very specific that happens, which is that resources have been increased, and now the maximum is 70,000. Initially, we had signed an agreement where we were going to select 11 projects, and now there was an additional resource that was added, and we're going to be able to select approximately 20 projects. So it's important to know this because increasingly we are able to arrive and to get that money to Indigenous organizations. And it can be women's organizations or it can be mixed organizations. So it's important to have access to resources to do our work. And it's important to remind you, or to mention anyway, that FIDA was the implementer of these projects. And you might say, well, why did they decide to decentralize it? The UN is super big. And well, what they did is they had a first call for proposals where it was all under FIDA. and the headquarters is in Rome. But for someone from Africa or Latin America or Asia to get to Rome was much more expensive. Sometimes they would send a consultant out to those regions, and that was more expensive than sometimes the money that they were able to send to the organizations. They also decided to decentralize because there were some organizations that had access to resources, but they never made reports afterwards. And so that money was basically lost. And so they decided that it would be better to have a call for proposals that could go directly to the communities. And so they decided to start the call for proposals and to ask Indigenous organizations, either of women or of mixed groups, to send their proposals to these regional organizations. So for Latin America, it's FIMI. For Asia, it's Beteva. And for Africa, it's Samburu. And they saw the importance of Indigenous organizations working for their own communities, and that in the regions there should be allies. FIMI brings together many Indigenous women's organizations. So we have contacts in different countries, and so the relationship is a closer relationship with the Indigenous peoples of the region, much closer than FIDA would have.
And as I mentioned, the implementation cycles in conjunction with the three organizations. At this time, we've had 4, and right now we are selecting the proposals. But those that have already been implemented are 3. The first one was 2011 to 2015. The second one, 2014 to 2018. And the third one, 2019 to 2021. And the fourth one is going to be 2022 to 2026. So having increased the amount for the projects, the implementation cycle for the projects also increased, and therefore the cycle for the agreement between FIMI and IPAF. 31 projects have been supported from 15 countries with these 3 projects, with a total amount of $1,729,910. This for Latin America, but for the other regions, there are also specific amounts. But the calls for proposals come at the same time and for the same year. So in FIDA, the mechanism is that FIDA makes the call for proposals, opens up the call for proposals, and once that's closed at the system that they have, then the regional organizations can come in. So we do the first review, which consists on analyzing whether the proposals come according to the criteria established from the beginning. For example, that the proposal is complete, that has a legal registration. Otherwise, it should come with a certification letter from the fiscal supporter, and then it has to come from an organization that has to be either Indigenous or working for Indigenous peoples, and also has to come with a free, prior, and informed consent letter. So those are the requirements that we review at the first pass. Once we go through that first pass, what we do is that through an advisory committee selected by the board of IPAF, because let me tell you also that IPAF has a board with members from the different indigenous peoples regions. So once we have, we've gone through the second pass, we hire consultants. In the case of Latin America, when we do this, we hire several of them. This time we had 5 consultants from the different countries. We send the proposals to them to evaluate them. We don't send them proposals from their own countries. So perhaps, because perhaps there may be a contact or something like that. So we send them proposals from other countries than their own. After that evaluation, we select, for example, at this cycle, we selected the best 10 from each evaluator for a total of 50. After that pre-selection of 50, what we do, again, in conjunction with the evaluators and FEMI's team, is that we look for references about these organizations, whether indigenous or not, whether they actually do work with indigenous peoples or not, what type of work do they do in their communities, is there really a free, prior, and informed consent? So all of this information is very important for us because what's happened in the past is that there are organizations that are not indigenous and that participate in these calls and are then selected. But then at the moment of implementation of their work, they're not that good working with indigenous peoples. So we go through this path to filter as much as possible so that we have organizations that do go for real to indigenous peoples. Because sometimes we have organizations who say, well, let me give you an experience, an example actually, of an organization that received funds from AINI. And one of the direct allies of the community, from the community, communicated with us. We had a meeting, and what he told us was that what the organization had done was bring some bags to collect fruit from trees, but there were not many. There had been a drought, and there was not a lot of fruit, and the organization never contacted them. So we don't want to have that kind of situation to happen again. So we'll review the organizations carefully so that when they receive funds from any of the mechanisms within AINI, they can actually do the work. So it's important for us to review the organizations with our evaluators so that when they go to the IPAF council, there are already good references and they can do a good selection. After we go through that second pass with the consultants, we then go through another pre-selection of proposals. For example, in the case of IPAF, we had 20, we selected 20 of the 50, we pre-selected 20. Once we had that group, we then sent that group to FIDA, and we say, these are the 20 recommended, and we add the recommendations as well so that the board can go through the final evaluation. And we hope that at that time, then the final selection would be a really good one. And that therefore there's also good implementation. These are the countries where we've implemented projects. So we have one in Argentina, Bolivia 2, Brazil 1, Chile 2, Colombia 5, Ecuador 2, Guyana 1, Paraguay 2, Peru 2, Suriname 1. In total, 19 projects for the South American region. In Central America, we have one in Belize, Mexico 3, El Salvador 2, Guatemala 3, Nicaragua 3, for a total of 12 projects.
En el caso de América Latina,
In the case of
es
Latin America,
común, por ejemplo, que
it's
lleguen
always common
muchas,
to
lleguen muchas propuestas de
have
países
many
como
proposals
Colombia,
from countries
Perú
such as Colombia,
y
Peru,
Bolivia. Sobre
and
todo de Colombia
Bolivia.
nos llegan muchísimas. Por ejemplo,
Especially Colombia, we get many of them. At this last call that we have open now,
más de 70 propuestas.
we received more
Y
than
151
70,
pasaron
and
Las
151
organizaciones que pasaron el segundo
passed
filtro
to the
de
second
estos IPA fueron
filter.
151.
So 151
63
went through, and
eran de
63
Colombia.
were from
Entonces, sí
Colombia.
cuesta también
So it's
hacer
always difficult
este balance geográfico.
to
Por ejemplo,
keep a regional balance.
recomendaciones que
For
hicimos,
example, within our recommendations for FIDA,
hicimos la selección
we
de
selected
propuestas,
6 proposals.
las 6 mejores
We
propuestas
selected the
evaluadas
best
por
6
los
proposals evaluated by
consultores,
each consultant.
pero
We were 5. But even so,
recomendaciones
we had
no por
recommendations,
porcentaje, sino
not by the greatest
eh,
number of
distribución
points,
geográfica.
but by geographical distribution.
Entonces, recomendamos propuestas
So
como de
we recommended
Chile,
proposals from Chile,
como de Surinam,
Suriname,
de Honduras,
Honduras,
de Nicaragua,
Nicaragua,
aún no teniendo
even though
puntajes altos, ¿no?
they didn't have the highest points necessarily. But then that is left to the APAF's board decision, whether they're selected or not, because that way we can balance it out. Otherwise, we would have always the same countries to select from, like Colombia and the others I mentioned. For example, Argentina is a large country, and Argentina sent very few proposals. Only one made it to the second pass to the selection, to the 50 selection, but did not make it to the last 20. So it's quite complicated. In the case of Paraguay, Uruguay, there are very few organizations that send us proposals. And if we have attendees here from these areas, it would be important to work together so that organizations can present proposals. Sometimes the ones that may present proposals are not indigenous. Once we look more into their work with their communities and grassroots work, is not really quite that satisfactory. So I encourage those of you present here from those areas to please work on this to present proposals. The final themes for financing are access to markets, mitigation of climate change and adaptation to its effects, food safety, nutrition and lands, territories and resources. But the main topic for the 6th cycle from IPA-FIDA is mitigation of climate change and adaptation to its effects. That was the main subject. In terms of achievements that we have obtained from all of this joint work are strengthening networks at the regional level and linking with initiatives in and out of FIMI. Also generating knowledge on our own indigenous peoples on development and agreement with their customs. Then recovery of ancestral techniques, and for community economy, and to revitalize the good life, the community good life or well-being. And the last one is training to contribute to increase technical administrative abilities of the organizations. This is very important for FEMI because we want to bring all of this work to people who can participate in different processes, such as the school here. And our team within INE has grown. It's not just me. We have an interdisciplinary group, a very valuable group of people. And what we do is that if there are organizations who present their projects and they have good ideas for proposals, but they don't know how to present well their work, what we do within INE is to help them present a good proposal. That is, we work with them so that they can, in the application form, present a good proposal. So we tell them, look, colleagues, the objective or the objectives and activities and the results need to be in agreement with what you are going to do. Look that these objectives would be drafted in this way, this and this other way. So we help them with the ways their work needs to be presented, because this is the way we strengthen processes and skills with them. And believe me, this has been very helpful to the organizations because they've been able to access other types of resources through that. And it is therefore very important to sometimes work with the organizations and hold them by the hand sometimes.
Ok. Bueno, aquí me regala un segundito que
Give me just a moment.
perrito por acá que está haciendo mucho
I have
ruido.
I have a little dog around me here who's making a lot of noise.
Ay, qué pena, pero bueno. Bueno, aquí
I am sorry. My apologies. Okay.
lo que le venía
So
haciendo
here I'm
énfasis
going to talk about what I have already discussing, and that is the strategies
estrategias de
for
implementación,
implementation. And
además de lanzar convocatorias, además de
so
trabajar
besides the calls for proposals, I'm
negociar
working in our internal mechanisms. As
firmar,
I said, and
no
reiterate,
solo en la
we do not
parte
focus only on financial support. We go way beyond that with the global school, the Global Leadership School. We've had great women leaders who have participated in the school, who've been trained and have gone to other spaces and who have participated in other programs and events, such as the Liderando desde el Sur program. And we also help other organizations to access webinars and participation in conferences, things like that. So this is all really crucial for us. So this is what FIMI does, which is different from other organizations. When we go to the various spaces to speak, I see that there are many organizations and many donors who only talk from the monetary results perspective, like how much they've helped, how much money they've given. But it is difficult to find donors who do this very valuable and complementary work that FIMI does. We always do an excellent work, like a virtual cycle, where we're always relating, connecting with the organizations. This is really important for us. That is to see organizations strengthen at many levels. Also, with all of the work that we have done within INE, the INE Fund, we also have knowledge materials. And this is the result from all of the work that we've done. For example, at the last cycle, When we finished, we made a landing page with the results
de los proyectos.
of the
Está
projects.
en los 3 idiomas.
It's in 3 languages,
IPAF.
and these are EPAF projects.
Entonces, súper bonito. Sí, lo
So
hemos
it's
publicado
beautiful
en
work.
internet.
We have
Súper bonito el trabajo
circulated this,
realizado.
distributed through various
Adicionalmente, también
networks.
consideramos
And it's beautiful work
que
because we also
además
consider
de
in
las
FIMI
organizaciones
that
obtengan su apoyo
not only that the
económico,
organizations have financial support,
las visibilicemos a través
but to also
de
making
diferentes
them
programas para que
visible
puedan acceder
through
a
the
oportunidades.
various FIMI
También creemos
programs
importante
so that they can have access to these opportunities. So
visibilizar
this is very
el
important
trabajo
to
que hacen las
make the
comunidades,
work
queda todo en el
visible.
informe
Because
y
if the work in the community remains in an inform or in a report in a computer,
por eso
that's the end of
necesitamos
it. So we
muchísimo
want
que
to
pudiéramos
distribute
contar con
the work
para
and
hacer
make it
este material de
uh,
conocimiento que
visible
fue
to
ha
many.
sido
And
valioso.
that is why
Miren,
we think that this is so important. Let me show you.
dar fotos, pueden
You will
darle
be able
un
to
clic
click on
proyecto,
the project and see
información
the
muy
work,
valiosa.
photos. There's very valuable information in all of them.
Está un poquito lento, pero bueno.
My computer's a little slow, sorry.
Valiosa que podemos
But there's very valuable
compartir con
information
ustedes.
that we can share with you.
Y bueno, muchas gracias. Y
And thank
quedo
you so much. I now
Muchas
would be
gracias.
very happy to take your
Así es que
questions.
ahora queremos invitar a todas
Thank
las
you, Johannes.
participantes a
We now
participar
invite all
o
participants
hacer
to take
preguntas.
advantage of this time
Ahora
and
que estamos
ask
en ese proceso
questions.
de
Now that we are
elaboración
in
de
this process
creo que
of writing our
información
advocacy
para que
plans,
esto sea
this information is
realmente
really
tenga ese sentido,
very timely
esa diferencia
for the work you're doing and for you to understand the difference that this makes and how to reflect these realities, how to present the realities that we have in our communities and connect it with the program. So the time is yours now. Dear leader women, ask your questions, take advantage of the opportunity to have Johannes here with us. You can raise your hand or simply request to speak.
¿Alguna pregunta?
Any questions? Medalith, go ahead, please. Yes, sister, a very good morning. I'm going to be very quick with my question about the hospital. And this is with respect to the fund. I would like to know if you have the number of funds or the money given by country, and if there are opportunities for all, if and how you evaluate the best proposal, and what types of proposals are most taken into account, or whether you take into account all ideas. Thank you, Medalith. Let's hear Doris's question as well, and then we'll have Johannes answer. Doris, go ahead.
Hi, I would just like to highlight what you said earlier about having teaching the organizations about giving them the technological and administrative skills that they need in order to access these different funds, because based on the field work that we are also doing here in the Philippines, we realize that it is really important to empower the different communities with this technological and administrative skills that are needed, like for instance basic English, basic basic financial, as the financial work that we do, to do the budget and all that. So because earlier there in one of the communities, they were requesting for it. So like we realized that not only the second generation leaders need these skills, but also our existing and present leaders, they need this. So I just wanted to highlight that. Thank you.
Gracias, Doris. Entonces, mientras otras
Thank you,
se
Doris. And while others think about questions, Johannes, can you please go ahead and answer these two? Look, Doris's comment is very valuable because it is true. Those of us who are in this work and make, calls for proposals and things like that, sometimes we consider it a given that we all know how to handle the different programs, Word, Excel, etc., and the different tools. And that's not so necessarily. There are people who know how to handle their budgets really well on paper with a pencil and paper, but they may not know how to transfer that to an Excel page. So we have had to teach through short processes, to show them how to use Excel and add their numbers up and things like that. We know how to do that, but there are people in our communities who are very good, but they don't know how to do that. So it's very valuable to be able to contribute a little bit in this arena so that organizations can have that training as well and have that knowledge as well, because it is difficult for sure to train all of them. Time is difficult to get, but it is at least significant that we are given that step and reaching organizations. For example, when we started with the INE fund, it was just me, so I couldn't do everything in the time I had. I could only do so much. But now that we have an interdisciplinary team, really valuable team, what we do now is establish training processes for our partners, which is beautiful. So about 2 months ago, for example, we had a training process in monitoring and evaluation of projects, for example. So this is all very valuable, and we are taking that huge step. And about the previous question that Medelith asked about how many countries, I can tell you that in the case of INE, and keeping in mind its mechanisms, with Liderando desde el Sur, there are there's data on specific countries. But if I'm not mistaken, these are countries that cannot receive resources, or countries that are considered rich countries. So in the case of Latin American countries with LDS, Chile and Panama cannot access those resources. New Zealand cannot either, but we have other mechanisms such as IPAF and Semillas, and they can access those resources through that. So right now, for example, there's a call for proposals open, because within the INE fund, with Semillas and Liderando, we have a bid process open now, and we're now going through the selection. And with IPAF, we also have another one open, and we're also going through the selection process. So in the case of these proposals that are not perhaps selected from a country because the donor does not admit that kind of the proposal from that country, we may have another donor who does. So we don't distinguish so much by country, like in INE, for example, because all kinds of countries can participate as long as they have indigenous peoples, and as long as the work is for and with indigenous peoples. So we have that freedom to do that. We don't discriminate in that case against those situations. What kinds of proposals? Well, as I was saying, we have a wide variety of topics that they can work in. We don't distinguish necessarily. We have some specific calls for bids in terms of subjects, but let me remind you that all proposals can be accommodated to the different subjects and topics. So the Indigenous women's organizations are the ones who who decide what topics they can work in.
For example, we don't accept proposals from political parties. We don't accept proposals for construction. Everybody wants to build something. No, we don't accept proposals where everything is for a project. It has to have mostly elements of trainings and those kinds of activities. For example, one of the proposals that I was evaluating in the first phase of Semillas, we saw that there was an organization that was only wanting to purchase cattle. And that kind of proposal would have been better to have proposed with, trainings, different ways of working with cattle. But if you're just a matter of trying to purchase something, then no, we're not going to accept that kind of proposal. I don't know if there's other questions. Thank you, Joannis, for these answers. We also want to invite you to keep in mind all of these realities that Professor Elsa has been sharing with us. What are the rights that are not as well implemented by the states, and trying to figure out how we can focus our projects. So we want to invite you to consider, to continue, asking questions and really take advantage of her presence here in this space. Any other questions right now or a comment? Regina, go ahead. We can hear you.
Okay. Thank you, Sister Ioannis, for your wonderful information. And what I would to ask is, like in my country, in Indonesia, there are a difficult situation to get fund from, like foreign fund from outside countries, because the issue of terrorism. So my government, like every foreign fund should go through the government, and uh, it is really hard for the grassroots level indigenous organization to get it, because in order to get the fund, you need some registrations in my country, which is really hard because of the bureaucracy of the country. So that's the problem that we face in a grassroots level here in Indonesia. So it's a kind of problem because of the government regulation. If you could give us some, maybe from your experience in giving funds and stuff, like if you could share your experience about that. Thank you.
Regina.
Regina, yeah, that's a really great question. In the case of Asia, it's always a challenge to work with community organizations. It's a region that when we do a call for proposals, there's very few proposals that come in, but I think it's because of the situation that you just described in your country. It has happened with us, with Indonesia, and also with countries like Bangladesh, Vietnam, and other countries in which the organizations, perhaps send in a proposal, But after they're selected, it's very complicated to actually transfer funds to them because they are organizations that, even if they're registered in their countries, they have to have the backing from the government to be able to receive money from outside the country. So what we have done with some of these organizations is for them to get a fiscal sponsor, an organization that is already qualified to receive funds, to be a channel for receiving that money and then giving it to their organization. Another situation that we have had is that often we don't do this very frequently because one of the requirements is for the organizations to have a bank account in their own name. And what we've done in some circumstances due to the situation where we try this way and that way to send funds and it's not possible, we end up sending to what's called Commonwealth funds or joint funds. But to be able to send to this type of an account, what we have to do is have an agreement of understanding between the various parties, letters that are signed, because it's also very important for us when we transfer money to a joint fund, if there's not a common understanding about what's going to happen to that money, sometimes that money is lost. So the members of the project really need to think clearly about how that process is going to work and so that the project can be implemented well. But it is a big challenge that we have in FEMI, in the INI fund for transferring resources. But what we do is we just make a lot of efforts so that that organization can have access to those funds. Thank you, Janice. Would anyone else like to ask a question? Or make a comment, perhaps? To perhaps share an experience of implementing a project that you may have done? I think the human part is extremely important, how the proposals can be strengthened. And Johannes has a lot of ideas about how to strengthen the technical part of your proposals, how you might write your proposals. Would anyone else like to ask a question along those lines or make a comment? A question from Africa, perhaps? Well, yes. If you, while you're thinking about your questions, I would invite Pratima to go ahead and give her reflections, because I believe she's part of the board of the IPAF Council. Thank you. She was very quiet. Juliana has her hand up. Go ahead, Juliana. Yes, thank you very much. Just a question here. In this process of getting direct access to funds, especially for Indigenous women, we know that for Indigenous organizations, it's been very complex to try to get access to funds. We've already talked about the fact that the technical and financial capacity might not be what it needs to be able to manage the funds well. And another thing that has been mentioned is that most of the grants require organizations to have a legal status in their country. But we know so many experiences of women's organizations that haven't been able to obtain legal status, and for that reason, they apply through intermediaries or fiscal sponsors. But I don't know, perhaps if you've had some experiences where you can strengthen capacity, because there's different levels of capacity. I don't know if through these funds you've been able to build these technical and financial capacities to be able to get legal status, to teach us how to do it, because in some cases, these steps are able to be taken, and organizations that could only access very small grants before are now eligible for larger grants. I don't know if this platform of helping women to get access to funds helps them to get access to larger grants by strengthening these capacities. Thank you very much. Yes, sister, very good question. Absolutely. There are organizations who are really very grassroots organizations. We had, for example, in the second cycle of EPAF, that was an organization from Colombia. The EPAF in general gives money to medium-sized and large organizations, but there are small organizations that take a big risk and present a proposal when the call is made. And so there was an organization from Colombia that was a very grassroots organization that was chosen by EPAF for this project. But since it was a grassroots women's organization, that didn't have all of the knowledge about how to use Excel or financial topics in general, and they didn't know how to write the report in the required format. So it was a huge challenge. But what was a challenge for them was also a challenge for us as the INE fund, because the accompaniment that we were able to give to them was it was a closer accompaniment. So we did give some training about how to get their ideas down on paper in the required format. We trained them on how to present the report with photos, how to send those photos, how to send files, how to send receipts so you can be accountable in terms of your expenses. So we really walked through the process with them, and it was a community-based organization that did their work very efficiently. It was very good work. And so we strengthened their process of report writing, but we also strengthened their capacity to the point where when they had such a well-implemented and innovated project that we helped them to have access to another resources with an access to another fund that we know of, which is called the Pawanka Fund. And so through the experience that they had with FEMI, they were able to gain access to other resources. And those other resources, they were able to handle that by themselves. We would ask them, answer some specific questions that they had, but the training and the strengthening of capacity that they had at the very beginning allowed them to be able to handle the second grant themselves, basically. And as we say here in Colombia, now they're totally unleashed and they're presenting proposals everywhere to try to get different kinds of resources. And so that's possible. If they're small and they don't have a lot of capacity, it's still possible, at least with FEMI. We can't get to every organization because we just have so many organizations looking for funds, but we are able to try to find specific organizations and help them with specific support in that way. So while you're thinking about your other questions, I want to turn the floor over to Pratima so she can give her ideas in terms of how IPAF works, and as a member of IPAF, because she's on the board.
Thank you, Johannes, and very good evening, I would say, from here. I'm not in my home country. I am right now out of my country, and it's a very honored to be with all of you. I am Pratima Gurung, and I am from Nepal, and I represent an organization which works on indigenous women with disabilities. The name of the organization is National Indigenous Disabled Women Association of Nepal. But also, I represent the Indigenous Persons with Disabilities Global Network as a General Secretary. So my role in the EPAF is also how do I bring the intersectional lens, which is one of the core thematic area that FEMI has been working since very long time. And this word has really been a buzzword, not only with FEMI, but also with Need One and also within the feminist organizations. So my job is basically to mainstream and to integrate the gender, that means the indigenous women's and youth and person with disabilities perspectives. So one of the core area that we would like to highlight and emphasize is, since we are in the EPAF board, we try to integrate inclusion and we try to focus on indigenous women's led initiatives. And when I say indigenous women led initiatives, we try to see the proposals coming from indigenous women's organizations who are in the decision making and who really want to bring a transformative change. And this is where we prioritize the proposals. And in the EPAF, we also have recently, we have also included the disability inclusion. If you look at the outcome document of the EPAT recently, which has been recently published this year in 2023, we had a meeting recently. And if you look at that document, it clearly outlines indigenous women, youth, and persons with disabilities and their meaningful participation and engagement at all levels. And when we say meaningful participation and engagement at all levels, it is through the entire process, from the very planning to the execution and also the monitoring and evaluation. And this has been clearly reflected and outlined in the EPAF proposals and also in the process of the EPAF. And this is where I see the indigenous women's organizations play a very critical role. They play a very crucial role. And this is where we want many indigenous women's organizations and also youth and persons with disabilities organizations to apply for the proposal so that we could regionally make them balance. We could also I got lost due to the internet fluctuating. I guess I'm audible right now. Am I right? Yes. Thank you. Sorry for that. So this has been integrated in the proposal. So that is why we really welcome. And there has been a technical, what do you say, support. It's not from the EPAF, but right now we are also trying to make the procedure, the proposal is as simple as we can. But we have not entirely gone through the proposal format, but we are still having discussion on those parts. And it's not only EPAF that I would like to share here in terms of funding and resources. When it comes to indigenous women, there are other women or feminist-led organizations who are supporting as a philanthropic organization. Just to give you some of the, what do you say, examples, that we have Mama Cass, we have Frida, we have Women Fund Asia, and there are many organizations who work on climate change, like the Global Green Grant Fund. So these are the kind of funds where we, as indigenous women, as a organization of indigenous women, we can apply to those funds, because we have clearly outlined in many of the proposal call that they prioritize for indigenous women and girls led initiatives. And this is where I see that there are many windows for applications and for opportunities to engage in coming days. I will just stop here and just to again forward to Yanis.
Gracias, Pratima, por tu reflexión.
Thank you, Pratima, for your reflections.
Una compañera, Lucía,
There is a sister who says, what I've noticed is that the administrative issue and accountability can be definitely complicated for women. Yes, there are many organizations, and not just women's organizations, but generally speaking,
realizar las rendiciones.
for whom it's really hard to do the accounting.
Un desafío, pero lo que hemos hecho dentro de FIMI,
But what we've done within FEMI,
bueno, ahorita estamos
well, right
haciendo
now,
inducciones, porque sí
we're
hemos
doing
hecho,
some inductions,
y que no hacíamos de pronto en convocatorias anteriores, y es que estamos
and we're doing
haciendo
something that we haven't done in
para
previous rounds, and that there's an induction process to show the organizations how to present their reports. So we're working on that with the organizations who receive funding, and we've also put out instructions on how to present receipts, what a receipt should look like, what is the due diligence with receipts, who needs to sign those receipts and invoices, and the signatures of the responsible parties of the projects, and how that needs to be included as well. So in FEMI, we are providing better opportunities now for the organizations so that they can do an accounting of their funds. We have always said that in FEMI, we don't close doors to any Indigenous women's organizations. It's the organizations themselves who close the doors sometimes. For example, if they have a scholarship through a FEMI project, and sometimes I just say implement it well, communicate well, and if you have any difficulty, talk about it with us. If you want us to help you with something, tell us, but please implement the project well, because inside FEMI there is a whole world of possibilities. And if you don't do a good implementation, you will close doors on yourselves. And in general, there's a lot of organizations in FEMI who have received grants just one time. And there's a lot of groups who get one grant here, and then they go to Pawanka, and then they go to the global school, or they go to some other decision-making space fund. So there are a lot of organizations that look for funds in a lot of other spaces. So it's really important that if you have financial support from FEMI or from any other grant maker, you need to be visible, you need to do everything that that grant requires. And it's hard because we can't get to every organization in all three regions. But make yourself visible. It's important to become visible as Indigenous women leaders who are empowered. And we can then help you to emphasize that leadership. There are some organizations who just send us a report and some photos and that's it. But there are some other organizations, they are sending us photos through WhatsApp all along the way and they say, look, we just did this activity. Look at this participant here at this event and what she's saying is this. And all of that helps us to visualize your work. And then we're able to help emphasize your work to put you up on that higher scale of donations or to recommend you to another donor or to recommend you to the Global Leadership School or to the decision-making funds. So that's very important. So I really want to invite you in your organizations to do what you can to promote and visibilize your work, not just to present a report and say, okay, we're done. You know, try to be as visible as possible so that we can identify leadership. Thank you, Joannis. FEME is a world of opportunities, for sure. And so our program is also trying to strengthen leadership capacity here of our participants. We have gotten to the end of our time for this particular topic. Thank you very much for all of the information and motivation and all of the encouragement, especially so that groups from different countries can present their proposals and plans and take advantage of these spaces. So we know you're on the FEME team, but we want to recognize your participation here, that FEME, the Global Leadership School for Indigenous Women, is recognizing here a Joannis Amador Lidueña for her participation and contribution in the formation of Indigenous leaders from Africa, Asia, Latin America, North America, and the Pacific. In this time, during the 10th edition of the Global Leadership School. So with gratitude and thanks, and you can see the signature of the FEME director there, Teresa Zapeta. Thank you so much, Joannis. And we hope to see you and have you with us at another time. Thank you very much. And now we will go on to our next subject. Thank you, Johannes. Now I'm going to give Winnie the floor, and she is going to facilitate the next part of the agenda. Thank you, and have a good week, all of you.
Hello, everyone. Good morning, good afternoon, good evening. Thank you so much, Hortensia, and thank you, Johannes, for that very informative session that we just had. Our next guest, you've already heard from her, but we will continue to hear from her in this next session. And you may have already guessed it that our next guest is Pratima Gurung from Nepal. Before I invite her to speak, I'm going to share a bit from her very extensive bio. So Pratima Gurung is the president of the National Indigenous Disabled Women's Association, NIDWAN. She's an academic activist and faculty member of Padmakaya College, a single women's college in Nepal since 2004. She also contributes as an expert of the Disability National Direction Committee, formed by the Ministry of Women, Children, and Senior Citizen Government of Nepal. She's also currently General Secretary of Indigenous Peoples with Disabilities Global Network. So today, Pratima is going to be speaking to us on characteristics and values of women leaders strategies for strengthening Indigenous women for political advocacy. And she's going to be giving us a perspective of Indigenous women with disabilities. So welcome, Pratima. It's very nice to see you again. You have about an hour and a half. You can choose how you want to structure the session. Please feel free to structure it however you feel and let us know how you want us to support you during your session. So thank you so much again for accepting our invitation and for coming to speak to the ladies here from the Global Leadership School. So please go ahead.
Thank you, Winnie, for this introduction, and very humble and very thankful for Femi for providing this opportunity and to have a discussion with all the sisters across the world. So it's a moment for me to celebrate and also to share the knowledge and the experience that we have. So I have my PowerPoint presentation, but before I go to my PowerPoint presentations, I would just like to make the conversation really very participatory. So for me, I have been told to give some of the thoughts, opinion, and session on what does the Indigenous women's leadership look like, and what are the strategies for strengthening Indigenous women for political advocacy. And in that regard, I'm very much confined with the work of Indigenous women with disabilities. So the session that I will be deliberating will be primarily focused from women with disabilities perspective. So before I begin my presentation and discussion with you, because I see the Global Leadership School of FEMI has really been instrumental, and it has really been crucial for the transformative change in terms of advocacy and in terms of changing the lives of Indigenous women. So in that regard, we have also realized in the recent days after the Beijing platform for actions and the initiatives that has been at the global level, we see that there has been shifting of the narratives, there has been shifting of the advocacy work, and that shifting is that women as a group is not a homogeneous group. It is a heterogeneous group. And this is where we see our elders, we see our sisters, Indigenous sisters who have claimed and who have asserted their rights as a heterogeneous group within the women, telling that Indigenous women are distinct. But this narrative has recently again been very much intense, looking at the different diverse group within the Indigenous women. So we have Indigenous young people and girls, we have Indigenous women with disabilities, we have Indigenous women from rural areas. So these are the kind of narratives that have come around within these 20 years of this global advocacy within the feminist movement and within the Indigenous women's movement, and primarily focusing on Indigenous women, the Second World Conference outcome document. So referring to these, documents and referring to these global initiatives, I just wanted to start this conversation and sharing session with you that you have been working and you have been advocating at your grassroots level and engaging with Indigenous women and girls at the grassroots level. But I just wanted to know from you that how many of you are aware about Indigenous people with disabilities in your community? How many of you have worked with Indigenous people or women with disabilities in your community, in your region? Could you share your experience? Even if you haven't worked with them, that would also make sense for us. So I would just like to request all the participants to raise your hands in the computers and express your opinion and thoughts on it. Any of you? Any of you can express your opinion and thoughts on it. Have you ever worked or have you ever integrated person with disabilities or women with disabilities in your work that you do at the country level, at the regional level? Yeah, I see Joy. Yeah, go ahead.
Hi, Pratima. It's so nice to see you. Thank you for being with us today. Yeah, I was really excited for you to come uh, because I don't work directly with people with disabilities, but I remembered when I was in my college days, I would intern with an organization that works with people with disabilities, and then I would volunteer to be a scribe for people who are visually impaired. So whenever someone was doing their state exams, I would go with a friend of mine and the person would dictate of what they want to answer in their answer sheets and we would write it for them. And I remembered it was very heart touching for me because I feel, there were very less resources for them. Sometimes there's always, there's miscommunications in translations. So that is one thing where I feel like my state does not really have the necessary resources to support people with disabilities. And, more space should have been given for them to actually just, excel and do well in their own terms. So, yeah, so that is one thing that has always been in my mind about how resources are very limited for people with disabilities. So I'm really happy that, you're here and we're starting these conversations because I really feel this is like the need of the hour.
Thank you, Joy, for sharing this. And I would like to reiterate again, when we talk about Indigenous women and girls, again, I would like to reiterate that Indigenous women and girls are not homogeneous group. We are heterogeneous group, and I will be discussing about women with disabilities. And why I will be discussing about people with disabilities, because any of us who are and who is at this moment listening to me through this Feeling Global Leadership School, I would like to highlight that disability is a status that can happen to any of us who are presenting here listening to me. So for me, if you experience my own if I want to share my own personal experience, I had an accident at the age of 7, so I was not aware that I would be disabled. And if you look at the global status, if you look at the global report of indigenous people, the global report says indigenous people are 2 to 3 times higher prevalence rate of being disability in their lifetime. So if you look at the prevalence rate of disability among the indigenous communities and non-indigenous communities, the indigenous communities have the higher rates of being disabled. So this is where the issue of disability has become very much prominent and critical to discuss in this conversation. And having said that, I just want to reiterate what Joy had explained to me. It's not about, definitely when we see a person with disability, the first thing that comes into our mind is pity. But today we are not discussing about pity. Today we are not discussing about vulnerability. Today we are not discussing about what do you say, incapability. Today we are discussing that indigenous women with disabilities are leading the political agenda. They are able to contribute and they have been contributing. Like me, I teach at the university as a professor. I serve within my government with the Ministry of Women, Children, and Senior Citizens. I also serve as an organization at the grassroots level through my organization, Need One, but at the same time, I'm also leading the Indigenous Women's Global Movement and the Global Agenda. trying to reflect disability and women with disabilities. What do you say? The agenda at the global level. So this is where we are today. I will be discussing about some of the very critical things about disability. So before I start my presentation, I would just like to, I think I'm able to, you're able to see my slide. Am I? Yes? Some of the things that you all are aware about this fact is among the indigenous women who comprise of 185 indigenous women, it is 54 million indigenous people with disabilities and 28 million indigenous women with disabilities all around the globe. So when we say all around the globe, we share a distinct characteristic features. We share a distinct identity, being a woman, being an indigenous woman, and being a woman with disability. So we have three layers of identity, and that layers of identity help us and that impact us to different kinds of experiences that is related to the intersecting forms of discrimination that is often laid to our lack of access to education, healthcare, ancestral land, which is related with our collective rights. And also, if you look at the level of poverty, the indigenous peoples themselves are have the higher rates of poverty. And when this is again transformed, or when this is again, what do you say, related with a disability, then we see that they are very much higher rate of poverty, and they are also very much related with the subjective of violence in different forms. So they experience different kinds of domestic violence, sexual abuse, including trafficking and armed conflict. And these are the experiences that is being shared with indigenous women, among indigenous women. And when this experience is further related with the disability identity, it has compounded form of discriminations and violence. And this is where the result of the impact of these discriminations and violence among indigenous women and girls with disabilities becomes very much, in a very much, what do you say, intensive form. When it comes to indigenous women with disabilities, we share that the indigenous women's participation in the public and decision making and advocacy at the global level. If you look at the indigenous women's overall, what do you say, the movement, we see the movement linked with the mainstream women's participation and engagement. And if you look at the entire uh, indigenous women's movement related with women's participation, related with the feminist movement, the political and the public decision making and the advocacy work from the feminist movement has increased in the past decades. But if you look at the indigenous women's movement in comparison to the women's movement, we find that there is a huge gap of indigenous women, and primarily women with disabilities, and also women from the rural areas, indigenous women who has different sexual minorities like LGBTIQ communities. These women are less visible in the political domain. That means they have less access to leadership positions. And this is where we see that they face multiple layers of discrimination in terms of participating in different events, such as being an indigenous women, they face stereotypes and prejudices, but at the same time, being a disability and having a disability, they also have stigma and barriers within the organizations, within the political parties, and the societal pressure because of the patriarchal mindset. We see that the space for indigenous women and women with disabilities in terms of recognizing their skills, in terms of their gender roles, it's very much limited. And this is where the unequal, what do you say, power dynamics is very much prevalent and very much limited to indigenous women. That is why most indigenous women and girls, including indigenous women with disabilities, they lack enabling conducive space to share their opinions both in the private and public sphere. We know that indigenous women and our sisters and mothers, they have played a very critical role and within the private sphere. They are dominant, but at the same time, all across the world, indigenous women are also being, what do you say, affected by the patriarchal norms and values. And this is where we find that most indigenous women and women with disabilities are not able to share their opinions in a very safe and in a very enabling space within the private sphere. And that is very much visibly seen within the public sphere. But apart from that, also we see that indigenous women and women with disabilities are not victims. We do not see them as a victims, and we ourselves have never projected them ourselves as a victim. When it comes to the climate change, when it comes to the meaningful participation and engagement at the community level, indigenous women and women with disabilities have always played a very critical and crucial role. So for us, it is clearly outlined that indigenous women and women with disabilities have skills and strategies for survival. They know the strategies for their people, for their communities to survive in a very sustainable way, and they know how to deal with their cultures. They have learned to survive with the oppressions and the marginalization that they have faced without losing the wisdom and the patience on them. And they also share the values and the principles and the knowledge of their, what do you say, indigenous identity. And this is where we defined and we claim and we assert ourselves that indigenous women and women with disabilities are knowledge holders. They are the custodian for the nature that we live. But however, we see that these contributions are often not acknowledged and recognized at the global level. And this is where we see that there is a need and requirement to, to push our agenda as a political and as a public level. And this is where I would say that I would be now reflecting on indigenous women with disabilities. So for us, it is now for a time to accept the realization that if we are not able to enhance our participation as indigenous women in the political and in the public decision-making process, we will be left behind. And this is where, in order to ensure the inclusion, in order to have an inclusive world, the role of the indigenous women and the role of the indigenous women with disabilities is very much crucial because they are contributing the roles as a decision makers, as a right holders in the family they live, in the society they live, and in the country that they are representing themselves. So for us, it is a very high time to reflect about the diversity of indigenous women, to make a political strong commitment from our own organizations and institutions and from our own community. And this is where indigenous women, including indigenous women with disabilities, can come collectively, have a greater solidarity, have a collective effort, and the joint collective effort will lead us to the path that we are envisioning, that we have gender equity towards gender equality in a very broader way. And this is how we can ensure the participation of indigenous women and women with disabilities across the world. And this is where we have been working in our organizations. Our organization, National Indigenous Disabled Women Association, has been working at the grassroots level. And what we do at our organizations is we are breaking the silos. We are deconstructing the unistructural traditional approach of gender lens about the feminist agenda. So when it comes to indigenous women's agenda, we are also trying to shift. We are also trying to bring the traditional siloed approach within the indigenous women's movement. So we are trying to look at indigenous women's movement in a very intersectional approach. And when I say intersectional approach, it is trying to integrate gender, indigeneity, age, disability, geography, and other marginalized identities at the global level, at the regional level, and at the national level. And this is where we have started building allies and synergies across the movement. So it is within the movement and within the cross constituency. And when I say cross constituency, we are advocating our political rights and our political advocacy within the indigenous women's movement, within the indigenous people's movement, within the indigenous youth movement, within the indigenous elderly people's movement. When we say elderly people, we have a respect to those elders, and we're trying to look from this perspective. And this is how we are stating our narratives as an indigenous women and girls with disabilities across the world. And this is where we represent 28 million indigenous women with disabilities across the world. And we work in a very different way. We work at the global level, we work at the national level, and at the regional level, and at the local level, indigenous women with disabilities. And that is within the movement and beyond the movement. And when I say beyond the movement, we have been working with the women's movement to bring the intersectional lens, to bring the indigeneity and the disability lens within the feminist movement. When it comes to indigenous women's movement, we have been trying to set the agenda and issues within the disability, from the disability and from the gender perspective. When it comes to disability movement, we try to bring the indigeneity lens in the disability movement. So we are trying to build the synergy within and beyond the movement. And this has really been a very good concrete example, a very good practices that the Indigenous Persons with Disabilities Global Network at the global level has been functioning. The global network was established in the UN Permanent Forum and in 2013, and this global movement of the indigenous persons with disabilities from 2013 has initiated these initiatives at the global level, and that initiatives have been trickled down from the global to the regional to the national, and national to the local level. And this is where we are working for indigenous women and girls with disabilities at the national level and the grassroots level. So for us, the political advocacy, how do we do the political advocacy as the indigenous women and girls with disabilities? So we have our own purpose. This is where we say that we have our distinct identity. Our distinct identity is not as indigenous people. Our distinct identity is not as a women with disability, but our distinct identity is as an indigenous women with disability. So we have a very clear mandate, we have a very clear purpose, and we have a very clear reason why we are indigenous women with disabilities, or indigenous women and girls with disabilities. And in this clear reason, we build the synergy, we build the gaps. That means we build the bridges of the gap, and we try to build the synergy within the movement. And this has really been a strategic, intervention at the global level. And I would like to share some of the very good examples that we have done so far. If you look at the UN Permanent Forum report on the 13th session of the UN Permanent Forum in 2013, there is a study on the situation of indigenous people with disabilities, which clearly outlines the situation and context of indigenous women with disabilities facing multiple discrimination, and why there is a need for political advocacy from the government, from the UN agency, from the development partners, and from the indigenous peoples themselves. So if you look at this document, this document clearly outlines about the political agenda of Indigenous women and girls with disability. If you look at the World Conference outcome document of the Indigenous Peoples 2014, we have been able to, outline and reflect uh, six, references on Indigenous persons with disabilities for the first time. And this has really been instrumental at the global level. If you look at the World Conference outcome document of the second Indigenous Women's Outcome, World Conference, which held in 2021, that also clearly outlines about Indigenous women with disabilities situation. And I know that you have been discussing a lot, and you will be discussing about the CEDAW General Recommendation 39, which is on Indigenous women and girls. So this is one of the very concrete recent example where we see the clear reflection and the situation and the political advocacy that has been outlined on Indigenous girls and women with disabilities. So these are the strategic interventions that we have done at the global level. If you look at the regional level, we have Asia Indigenous Peoples Pact, and we have an organization like Asia Indigenous Women's Network. We have a network of Asia Indigenous Peoples Pact within NIWA, which is Network of Asia Indigenous Women across Asia. So in those, structures also, we had been asserting and claiming our rights as Indigenous women with disabilities at the regional level. So the disability inclusion for the first time in the Asia region by the adoption from the Asia Indigenous Peoples Pact by the recent General Assembly is one of the very concrete examples and a very good example to rest of the world that how disability inclusion is being mainstreamed within the Indigenous Peoples Organization. So these are the concrete examples when it comes at the regional level. But if you look at the national level, if you look at the concluding observation of the UN Convention on the Rights of Persons with Disabilities, if you look at the concluding observation of the Convention of the Elimination of All Forms of Discrimination Against Women, that is CEDAW, that is given to our state, that is Nepal. So if you look at those documents at the national level, we have a clear reflection and references on Indigenous women with disabilities. So these are the very concrete examples that we have achieved at the national, regional, and global level through the strategic intervention. This is where we also understand that Indigenous women with disabilities are not privileged all the time. If you look at my position, we are also reflecting our position from both the perspectives. That is, looking at the marginalized perspective and looking at the privileged position. Because if you look at the multiple and intersecting identities, sometimes the identity of an individual becomes a privileged position, like me. Sometimes my identity, when I look at in the broader, in the holistic movement of the feminist movement, I find my position in the marginalized position. So we are trying to reflect, and we are reflecting our experiences as a multiple identity groups and the impact in both the marginalized and privileged position. And this is where we understand our values and principle of individual and collective rights, because we as a women with disability, we share individual rights, and we as Indigenous women, we share the individual and collective rights. So we are very clear, and we are very, we make a clear demarcation line among what is our collective common agenda and what is our departure, what is our departing point. And this is where, when we talk about the political advocacy, we work with the disability movement at the global level, and we work with the Indigenous peoples and Indigenous movement, the women's movement at the global to the national level. But those are the collective initiatives. But we sometimes we work independently with those constituencies. And working independently with those constituencies is we have a demarcation, we have a departure point. How do we, what do we say, how do we do our political advocacy? And this is where we have been reflecting the issue of Indigenous women with disabilities in a wider and in a holistic way. This is where we know what our power is. We know where our position is. We know that our positions and power as Indigenous women and girls with disabilities are very limited when we talk about the political advocacy. So there is a need for enhancing the individual and community spaces with our, what do you say, lived experience. And this is where we say that Indigenous women with disabilities have their lived experience, and those lived experiences are expert. Those lived experiences gives meaning to their life. Those lived experiences gives expertise to their lives. So if you talk about myself, I have been working with the feminist movement and Indigenous women's movement, and this is where we try to, what do you say, reinforce and try to reflect our own lived experiences. And this is where we try to frame our agenda from the disability inclusion perspectives, from the meaningful participation perspectives, from the accessibility needs perspective, which Joy was talking ahead when she was talking about the giving the examinations and supporting to persons with disability. So those are the accessibility needs. So most often we as the Indigenous people and we as the Indigenous women's organizations and representatives do not know how to deal with persons with disabilities or women with disabilities. But how do we ensure the meaningful participation? How do we mainstream the disability inclusion within our strategies, within our political advocacy? Is we try to know, we try to respect the knowledge and experiences, the lived experience of women with disabilities. And this is where we try to connect within us and beyond the boundaries with the holistic and comprehensive approach. And when I say holistic and comprehensive approach, it's looking from a very wider perspective. It's looking and perceiving from a gender, from a cultural, from a disability, and from an age sensitive approach. So we try to integrate these elements within the work that we do. And this is where we generate the evidence from the ground and we do our advocacy at the grassroots level. And this is how Indigenous women with disabilities, as we say that we are changing our narratives, it is very crucial for us to have a twin track approach. So when I say twin track approach, it is an approach within ourselves and it is an approach beyond ourselves. So how do we integrate women with disabilities within the Indigenous women's movement? But at the same time, how do we frame within the feminist movement about Indigenous women and women with disabilities? And for that, we have been generating our lived experiences and knowledge at the grassroots level with the evidence-based advocacy. So most of the work that we do at the grassroots level is generating knowledge, generating those evidences. And for that, we look Indigenous women with disabilities and girls with disabilities, that they have courage. We look them for an agency of change. We know that they are in a vulnerable situation, but most often we claim ourselves that we are not vulnerable all the time because we have been promoting to the young people through the intergenerational knowledge that has been transformed from one generation to another generation. And this is where we have been reflecting our, what do you say, our experiences, our knowledge, our evidences through the research and documentation at the grassroots level. Just to give you an example, we have been conducting different impact of the climate change on Indigenous women and girls with disabilities. We have been conducting the situation of Indigenous people with disabilities across Asia region. We are trying to have the assessment of Indigenous people with disabilities because one of the agenda that Indigenous women across the world is raising is about disaggregated data. And when we talk about disaggregated data, we are also we do not have evidences on violence against Indigenous women. We do not have evidences on discrimination that is a collective and cultural discrimination against Indigenous women. And when it comes to women with disabilities are further lag behind with this data and information. And this is where we're trying to generate the evidences from the national labels. And when we generate the evidences, we are trying to be accountable on ourselves and trying to be inclusive. And the last one is we value and we respect the notion of nothing about us without us as Indigenous women and also as a women with disabilities across the world. So our power to the political advocacy is we are collective, we build a solidarity and synergy within the Indigenous women's movement. And that solidarity and the knowledge that we have been transforming is a agency of change within our community and at the global level is a paradigm shift that we are looking for the political advocacy. We know that this is a collective journey among all of us, but I would say that this journey has already started. It is a collective journey of Indigenous women and Indigenous women with disabilities. And it is time for us to join hands together collectively, bringing this agenda at the political, what do you say, at the political and at the public sphere to claim and assert our rights. So I will just stop here, thanking you, all of you, and listening to me. And if you have any questions and queries, I would be very much honored to respond to you and share the more kind of experiences that you would like to hear from me. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Fatima, for sharing with us this very important work that you're doing, not just as you, but persons living with disabilities. It's a very important intersection that we keep referring to, but always there isn't enough being done across the globe to address the issues of people with the disabilities, and especially for giving us that perspective and for sharing the work that you're already doing, not just at the national level, but also at the international level with other peoples from different countries. And so, ladies, I want to open up the floor for anyone who has a question or a comment or an experience that they want to share on this topic that we've just heard about. You can put your hand up, or you can write a question or your comment on the chat, and Pratima will be able to respond to you. So any questions or comments? Jonari?
Yeah.
Buenos días.
Yes, good day, good afternoon, good evening to everyone. Thank you so much, Professor Pratima, for giving us such valuable information. This will help us for the execution of our advocacy plans. Here in the Caribbean coast of Nicaragua, both in north and in south, I have seen that one of the obstacles and biggest problems that we face has to do with how we refer to people with disabilities. There are some terms that are used that are not the appropriate terms. And so these terms mean that Indigenous women with disabilities have their self-esteem affected in activities related to awareness raising on disability and how we can talk about this issue and what terms to use. We have learned that it's important to use other phrases. And so I think this is one of the barriers that we need to overcome as Indigenous women and also as countries. We need to raise awareness of the people in our country about how to talk to people about Indigenous women and about Indigenous women with disabilities. I don't have a disability, but 5 years ago, I had an accident where I fractured my right arm. And after this, I wasn't able to use my hand in the same way. And the broken arm didn't heal completely, and so I can't straighten it up completely. And so in my own experience, I can say that this was extremely hard. I was a child still, and bullying began and harassment at school. Children would make fun of me at school, and in public spaces, people would make fun of me. And I would say, why are they making fun of me if I feel like I'm fine? I don't feel like this arm is limiting me in any way because I never let it be a limitation. And I think having the force of will has meant that Indigenous women have learned to value ourselves and to value the efforts that we are making as lived experience. So thank you very much for talking about these subjects.
La sensibilización en cuanto a nuestras comunidades indígenas, pero también a la sociedad en general, para poder tener esta base de respeto en cuanto a todos nosotros.
Towards everyone. Thank you.
Thank you, Johnny, for your sharing and explanation. I just want to reiterate something about the terminology that you shared about when it comes to a person with disabilities, because we have different words and terminology that has been used in literatures, that has been used in our society, that has been used in our day-to-day lives. But if you look at the Convention of the Rights of Persons with Disabilities, which is called also in a very short form CRPD, if you look at the CRPD, the Convention of the Rights of Persons with Disabilities itself is a paradigm shift. So that does not look person with disabilities as an object. They are persons themselves. They are human beings themselves. And when we say human beings, they are equal to all human beings and have a dignified life. So that is the basic fundamental, human rights of person with disability. So we use the terminology like persons with disabilities for disabled people. We even cannot say disabled people or differently able people. So if you use this terminology demean our dignity. So when I say demean our dignity, we are not able to live a dignified life as others. And this is where person with disabilities is an appropriate human rights language for stating people with disabilities or persons with disabilities across the world. And when it comes to Indigenous women, we claim that our first identity is Indigenous. That is why we put Indigenous at the front and we put women with disabilities. Otherwise, we would have women with disabilities from Indigenous communities. We would do that. No, we felt ourselves when we are and when we were in our mother's womb, our first identity is our Indigenous identity.
disability. And this is where we have been using Indigenous people with disabilities and Indigenous women with disability. The second thing that I wanted to highlight is about the status of disability. How do you define disability? So to have a disability, if you look at the Convention on the Rights of Persons with Disability, to have a disability, you need to have three components. The first one is the impairment, that is the functional impairment. The functional impairment will be three status. It is the sensory impairment, it is the physical impairment, and it is the mental impairment. So among these three types of impairment, and plus when you have an impairment, and plus when you have a social barriers, if you have a barriers, the environmental barriers, the social barriers, the functional impairment plus environmental barriers is a disability status. If you look at the Convention on the Rights of Persons with Disability, it does not define the definition of disability because disability is an evolving concept. So to have a disability, you need to have a functional impairment and a social barriers, which is a long-term, what do you say, impact. It has to have a long-term impact. For example, if you got an accident and if you are using a crutches for 3 months, you are not a disabled person, okay? So to be a person with disabilities, you need to have a long-term, what do you say, impairment. And that long-term impairment is also related with the social barriers that you have. And that has been clearly outlined in the Convention of the Rights of Persons with Disabilities. So the disability varies from one country to another country. So if you look at the types of impairment in different countries, like in my country, we have 10 types of disability impairment. If you go to other countries, in some of the developed countries, there is no any types of impairment because there is a very strong social protection measures provided by the country to persons with disability. So there are differences. If you look at Latin America, if you look at Africa, if you look at Caribbean, if you look at the most developed countries like Australia, the condition of disability, the understanding of disability, it varies from one individual, it varies from one context, it varies from one country to another country. So it's a very broad, complex, sensitive, and evolving concept of disability. And this is where the Global School of Leadership, and this is where we are telling FEME that disability inclusion need to be the course of the Global Leadership School. And this is where the first opportunity for having discussion with all of you to share these experiences are very crucial because we have persons with disabilities and women with disabilities in our community. How do we treat today? How do we look there? Do we only look them as a vulnerable? Do we only look them as a incapable? We need to be sensitive because they are part of our society. And disability is a societal issue. It is everyone's issue. So if we are aware, if we are sensitive about disability, that will also make inclusive towards our children, that will also make inclusive towards elderly people. And that will be accessible and that will be, what you say, inclusive for all people. And this is where the understanding of disability has to be seen in a broader way. This is what I just want to reiterate with you. Thank you.
Thank you, Fatima. And thank you for also explaining many times. Thank you for that explanation. For us, Elizabeth, I had seen your hand up. I don't know if you still have a question or was it already responded to? And if there's anyone else who has a question or please.
Sí. Hola, buenos días. Buenos días, buenas tardes, buenas noches para
Hello and greetings to everyone. Interpreter apologizes, the sound is not very good here.
la escuela dar únicamente
Sorry, the sound is not understandable.
en especial es tan importante
This issue
que creo que hemos sido de alguna manera,
is one
creo que hemos sido tan conscientes
in which I don't think we have been very aware. We haven't always included this perspective of disability.
Niños, niñas con alguna
And because there are often children, boys and girls, who may have some sort of disability.
nuestros miedos quizás también
And perhaps we are a little bit afraid, or we feel some limitations in terms of their knowledge about their situation.
no colocar
And that means that we don't work on actions that could broaden access to rights.
garantizamos accesos a derechos a las
Because the point is how to make sure that people with disabilities who live among us have access to the same rights. They're part of our peoples, part of our families, they're our brothers and sisters.
que ahí están y creo que es algo importante porque al menos en la comunidad
And that's very important. In our community in Mexico, there's definitely a percentage of people who have disabilities,
de nacimiento
perhaps something that they were born with.
a pensar de
And
incluso de saber cuáles son las discapacidades
we need to take a good look and see what kinds of disabilities exist. And we don't always have that data, as our sister was saying. We need to know how many and girls and boys and get that disaggregated data. And often we don't have spaces of inclusive spaces for education, and even in formal schools,
existe la necesidad de separarlos porque en México pues hay
there is a separation of people with disabilities from the other students.
y que no sé si el término sea bien hablando de términos que luego dicen con capacidades diferentes pero
And sometimes we say people with different abilities,
y la cuestión de algunos lugares a las personas con discapacidad las separan, ¿no? Sobre todo cuando
but in some places they're separated
en las escuelas
in schools. They get to sent to different places or different classrooms.
como la sociedad está
And I think this is one of the ways that people with disabilities are seen as different. And of course, we're all different, but it's a way of saying that they can't really participate in these social issues. So there are a lot of barriers in our countries and in our communities. And public access for people with disabilities is also a problem. Not just wheelchair access, but different kinds of access are important. And all of these inequalities and barriers exist. So as organizations and as students, how can we have this on our agendas? Perhaps our central topic doesn't have to do with people with disabilities, but that doesn't mean that we would leave that aside, because we know there are people with disabilities in our villages, and so we'd like to include them in our agendas and our policies and projects to make sure we include their perspectives. And it would be good to teach people about the Convention on the Rights of People with Disabilities and start thinking about those rights and how they are linked to our struggles. Because part of it has to do with generating principles of communal action and inclusion. So that's my comment. And what occurs to me is that we first need to inform ourselves and then get information out to our communities, because we often have a great deal of ignorance on this issue.
Thank you so much, Elizabeth, for your remarks and for your opinions and thought. I really appreciate from core of my heart, and thank you, because the first thing I would say is we know that people with disabilities or women with disabilities are left out. So from this, what is a global leadership school, I really want to request all of you to open your heart, to open your minds, to see person with disability as equal as other people. This is the first thing that we can start from our individual level, from our community level. Listen to them becomes the second step that I would like to request to them, because every individual is different. Every individual's needs and priorities are different. And every individual as a person with disabilities can contribute to the family, to the society that they live. So look them not as a vulnerable people. Look them as they can contribute. If you look from that lens, if you look from that perspective, your perspective will change. And this is how you start with the honor of respecting them with a dignified language. You try to go with them and ask your needs and priorities with them. So this is the third thing that I would like to request all of you. And when we are working at the community level, we have a tick line, our donors like FIMI, like INE, the other funders, Pawanka, and also the EPAF, they give you the, tick shine. How many people, male, female, young people, person with disability. So in most of the discussion, persons with disabilities are not inside the room. So let's begin the conversation. Let us begin the work that we do at the community level. Try to bring persons with disabilities inside the room. Try to bring our brothers and sisters inside the room. And this is where you can learn from them. This is where you can start an inclusive world. This is where we can all say that we all are working in a human rights based approach. Otherwise, if we only say that we are indigenous women, we work on the indigenous people's rights and a human rights perspective, I think that is not justice for all of us. We need to integrate 28 million indigenous women and girls with disability who exist in this world within our community. So let's reflect from that lens. Let's look from that perspective, and let's have more rich conversation among us. What is disability inclusive? What are accessibility needs? How do we understand people with disabilities? How do we communicate with them? How do we mainstream? How do we make our, training? How do we make our workshop accessible? We can share with each other the knowledge that we have. The thing is, we have to start. And the Global Leadership School, I really want to thank the Global Leadership School for providing me this opportunity to start the conversation with all of you. And I think this conversation with you really reflects you to go back to your community and look at those people who are always being left behind. Because we are also talking about the SDG leaving no one behind. So let's make a kind of commitment, and I really thank for all your opinion that you have raised. Those are valid opinions, but the opinion changes when you see per person with disabilities as a contributors, and this is what we are looking forward. Thank you.
Thank you, Fatima. Sorry, my internet is really slow, so my video is off. But sisters, we still have some time with Fatima. So is there anyone who has a question or a comment that they want to give. I saw on the chat that Lucia wrote, yes, the issues of Indigenous women in public policies pending agenda. One, that Indigenous women are not mentioned, and two, that there is no disaggregated data. I agree with you completely. I think this is in reference to what you mentioned earlier. So I don't know, is there anyone else who has a question? Sisters from Asia, from Africa, Pacific, the United States. Is there anyone who has a question or a comment for that matter? So Pratima, just as they formulate or think about their questions, I wanted to ask about the global movement that you represent. And of course, I'm asking because from a place of no knowledge, because of the amount of information that we do or do not have. And so I'm just wondering if you could share a bit more about the global movement that you represent for people living with disability, like, you know, if it's people living with disabilities, Indigenous peoples living with disabilities, and how some of us can connect people living with disabilities from our own communities to this global network of Indigenous peoples who are, you know, who are doing incredible work. So I wanted to find out if you could please share a little bit more about that.
Thank you, Winnie, for your questions and queries. Definitely, I would say that as I have already told that we are 54 million Indigenous people with disabilities and 28 million Indigenous women with disabilities. And this group is being constituted at the global level through the Indigenous Persons with Disabilities Global Network. So we have 7 members from the 7 geopolitical regions. So we have a person from Kenya, Africa, who is a member from Africa. So we have some members from Latin America, Olga Montupar from Latin America, and myself, I represent Asia. So we have 7 geopolitical regions with 7 members from the global level that consist of the Indigenous Persons with Disabilities Global Network. And this global network was supported by the Disability Advocacy Right Fund in 2011 for the first time to come at the UN Permanent Forum and to form a disability caucus. And by forming a disability caucus for the first time in the UN history, in the UN Permanent Forum, Indigenous people with disabilities created a space within the UN Permanent Forum and within the Indigenous Peoples Movement. And this is how the study that I mentioned to you in 2013 was done for the first time on Indigenous people with disabilities. So from that historical time to this time, if you come and if you look at the Indigenous Persons with Disabilities Global Network, you can be, if you have an organization of Indigenous people with disabilities, or if you do not have an organization, but you have an individual with a disability from an Indigenous community who are active, you can be part of the member of the Indigenous Persons with Disabilities Global Network. So it can be an individual member or it can be an organizational member. So depending on the capacity that you have at the country level, we invite you to join us together in the Indigenous Persons with Disabilities Global Network, or we request you to reach to those persons telling about the structures that exist at the global level. So we also work at the regional level. We have many friends working at the regional level. For example, as I explained to you, we work with the Asia Indigenous Peoples Pact. We work with the network of Indigenous women in Asia, that is NIWA. We work also with the South Asian Disability Forum. that is a disability constituency. And we also work with the APWLD, which is a women's movement at the regional level. So if you look at the structure, we work within the women movement, we work within the disability movement, we work within the indigenous women's movement. So that is the kind of intersectional lens that we put. But in Asia, in Africa, if you have organizations and individuals, you also can be connected at the regional level. And at the national level, if you do not have an organizations, if you know individuals, you can request to them or you can encourage them to form an organization at the national level. And this is where some of the what do you say, funding agencies like the disability advocacy work, which has been working in Uganda, which has been working in Tanzania, which has been working in Kenya, it has been working many countries across Africa. It has been working in Latin America. So those funding agencies can support indigenous people with disabilities to form an organization at the national level. In the context of Nepal, we were not being funded when we started claiming our rights because our government did not recognize the multiple and intersecting identities. That is why we had a challenge. But later on, we came to know that this was a human rights issue, and we tried to organize since 2006. But we were only able to establish our organization in 2015, the National Indigenous Disabled Women Association Nepal. So it's a long history of our struggle. It's a long history of discrimination. One of the things that I would like to highlight is being a multiple intersecting identities. I would say that I myself, I feel that I am everywhere, like in the women's movement, in the indigenous people's movement, in the disability movement. But the reality is I am nowhere. That is the reality because we are left within our movement. And when we talk to violence and discrimination, if you look at indigenous women with disabilities, they are raped, they are abused, they are sexually discriminated and abused in the private sphere by their own family members. If you look at the prevalence rate of violence is 91% among indigenous women and girls with disability. So it is a very high risk and unsafe situation. And if we do not discuss about this unsafe situation and sensitivity towards these groups, we are losing our humanity. So this is where the importance of having an organization, the importance of bringing those individuals and building their capacity within the indigenous women's movement is very much critical. And I think PME has really played a very instrumental role for us. If you look at the Second World Conference on Indigenous Women's Outcome document, if you look at the general recommendations, that clearly outlines, and this is a very eye-opening and an avenue for us to work together to bring those unheard voices into our domain to make them visible. So I think we can start having conversation from the national level, from the regional level, and from the global level. I can also provide you my email address here in this what do you say, chat group. So if you need any kind of what do you say, information, if you want to link me any kind of people who are in your what do you say, communities, who are active, who can contribute, who can be part of this movement, we really would like to welcome those individuals through your support. So it is starting those initiatives, and I have just put down my what do you say, my email address, and I would like to join all of you for referring to those individuals, for establishing organization of people with disabilities, and for joining hands together to bring a collective and solidarity movement among us.
Thank you, Fatima. Please, ladies, take advantage of the connections that Pratima is offering, especially for the people in your communities that you're working with or that you know of that are working also in your own communities in different ways or different approaches related to people's living with disabilities. So please write to her if you need to be connected to your regional focal points. Please write to her also so that you know what activities are going on within the region or even internationally and how you can best engage both at the regional, national, and the international level with the movement. So we still have more time. So if there's any other questions, we can take about 2 questions before we can hand it back to Pratima for her closing remarks. So are there any other questions or any comments that you have before our sister leaves? Anyone? Okay. So you do have Pratima's email. In case you lose it for whatever reason, please write to us. We will be able to share it with you again. Please reach out to her to ask any questions or again to seek connections that you to your regional focal points for working with Indigenous peoples with disabilities, and please engage with them when they have activities or when they invite you for activities. So Pratima, I'll hand it back to you maybe for any closing remarks you have. Oh, okay, wait. There's someone who just wrote on the chat. Pema is asking, I wanted to know how we can adopt intersectional lens in our, sorry, how we can adopt an intersectional lens in our own organizational work.
Yeah, thank you, Pema. Pema represents my organization, Need One. So she has been working with Indigenous women and girls with disabilities in Nepal. So for us, the intersectional approach is one of the foundation, one of the ground. If you look at the philosophy of what is the intersectionality, it is a very complex issue. But when I say complex issue, there are some practical, what do you say, strategies that we have been integrating in the work that we do at the institutional level. And when I say the practical, what do you say, advocacy strategies that we have been integrating is, first of all, as I mentioned to them, that we need to collectively unite each others. We need to bring the groups who are with the multiple marginalized identities. And when we try to bring those multiple marginalized identities, we need to ensure the safe, conducive, and enabling space. These are the preconditions. And when it comes to women with disabilities, the accessibility needs are the preconditions. These are the standards that we need to set in order to ensure intersectional led. So for us, working on Indigenous women and girls with disabilities at the grassroots level, we try to ensure and we try to reflect the safe and conducive environment where they can express their opinions, where they can express their lived experiences, where they can express the challenges that they face as a woman, as an Indigenous women, and as a woman with disability. Because most of the multiple and intersecting identities groups are not aware about the impact of the multiple marginalized identity at the grassroots level. And this is not an example of Nepal only. This is an example at the global level, because I work at the global level. I work with the International Disability Alliance, providing a bridge model training on disability inclusion. It has a 3 sets of training layer. The first, Bridge Model 1, which is for 12 days, the Bridge Model 2, which is for 18 days, and the Bridge Model 3, which is for 21 days. So these are the training modules that has been set at the international level. And I've been providing trainings in more than 45 countries across different regions. And one of the good thing that we have done through that training is bringing persons with disabilities from the most marginalized groups. And when we bring persons with disabilities from the most marginalized groups, from the diversified groups, we try to set those standards of the precondition which I explained to you. So the safe, conducive, and enabling with accessible environment, understanding the needs and priorities of Indigenous people, including persons with disabilities from diverse impairments, is the precondition. That is the first thing. The second thing is we try to listen to those, what do you say, advocacy. We try to listen to those stories. We try to listen to those voices. And if we try to listen to those voices, we come through the challenges that they have been facing. And when we come through the challenges they have facing, we try to prioritize the challenges depending on the constituency that they, what do you say, they reflect themselves. For example, if my identity as an indigenous is dominant, and if I'm facing the challenges as an indigenous women, like the challenges related with language, so I need to talk with the indigenous people's constituency to ensure and to reflect the challenges faced with the language related with the culture. So if it is a challenges related with accessibility, then we connect with the disability constituency. And sometimes when it comes to the multiple marginalized identities coming together, we look at the intersectional lens by the common agenda, which I have described you in my earlier presentation. So we look at those commonalities at the same time being a multiple marginalized intersecting identity. But at the same time, we also look at the departure point. So depending on the needs of an individual, we look at those commonalities and we look at those differences. And these are the strategies that we have been reflecting at the grassroots level to the multiple marginalized identity. And there are other, what do you say, strategies which I explained, like the cross-movement collaboration, having a disaggregated data, trying to amplify those grassroots voices, trying to bring and generate evidences through research and documentation. So these are the concrete strategies that I would like to highlight at this level. But at the same time, it is also building and knowing about the gaps at the global level. And this is what we have been now advocating with the PMI, with the Indigenous Peoples Organization, and within the funders also, which Johannes was explaining about. Because right now I'm also representing in different, what do you say, funding agencies. So we do not want ourselves as only receiving the funds, because we also want the funders to be accountable, to be, what do you say, inclusive of indigenous women and also women with disabilities. And this is where we say, and we are claiming that we need to be in the decision-making position. We do not only want to receive funds as a passive recipients. And this is where our contributions make sense at every level.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Fatima. Maybe I'll read a comment from Maria before I can hand it back to you for your closing statements. Thank you, Fatima, for the wonderful presentation. We work with different grassroots organizations, and we have one with women with disabilities. Through advocacy work and empowerment programs, this has enabled them to come out and have a voice than before, whereby they had fear. Yeah, so I think that's Maria sharing some of the experiences from her own organization. Thank you, Maria, for that. And also thank you, Fatima, for those strategies that you've offered us in terms of working with people living with disabilities, strategies that you're using in your own organization. And so thank you for that. So I'm going to pass it back to you for any closing remarks you have before we can close the session.
Yeah, thank you, Winnie, and thank you for all of you for listening to me. I just have a final remarks on the presentations and on the savings that I have put forward to you. Is let's start working with people with disabilities, and when we start working with people with disabilities and living with disabilities, and when we talk about inclusion, we have not included. That is why we need to put them in priority. If you do not put them in priority, just to give you a concrete example, right now I am in Bali. I am right now in the Indigenous Peoples Solidarity Fund. And this morning we had a discussion because if you look at the governing body of the Indigenous Peoples Solidarity Fund, the proposal that was made was we only had 2 members. That comes from women, that comes from youth, that comes from person with disabilities, and that also represents the regional, constituency. So among these 4 groups, women, regional constituency, youth, and person with disabilities, we were told to come only 2 people representing from this constituency. And I had a very clear position on my own. How can a person with disabilities be reflected in that representations when you do not mention clearly if there is one representative from person with disability or one representative from women. So if we have 2 only representations, and if that representation does not include women, if that is a regional, movement-based constituency, how does that a movement-based constituency provide justice to women's issue? That was my concern and query. And this is where we try to create our space. And we told that, no, if we have 4 constituency, there should be 4 representatives from those representative, constituency. We have women from one, we have youth from one, we have person with disabilities, and we have regional constituency member reflecting from one constituency. So this is how we are creating our own narrative. But sometimes our voices are very much limited. And this is where I just want to request to you, even if our voices are not there, even if we do not have representation, let's begin ourselves reflecting on inclusive and trying to prioritize people with disabilities in terms of providing the support, in terms of providing the training, in terms of building the empowerment and the political advocacy that we are envisioning through this global leadership code. So I would like to encourage all of you to join hands together, integrating and mainstreaming disability and women with disabilities in the work that we do. And this is where we can make an equitable society for all. And this is what we are envisioning for the inclusive world. And thank you for listening to me. And I hope to have further collaboration, consultations, and are doing a collective advocacy with all of us. Thank you for this time.
Thank you so much, Fatima, and thank you for not only making time, but also thank you for all the work that you're doing and for sharing your experiences and opening and being open about the work that you do, the challenges that are faced people with disabilities. So thank you for that. And I hope that the ladies here will reach out to you to ask more questions or to ask for connections where it's needed so that they can continue to elevate the work that they're doing with other Indigenous peoples living with disabilities in their own communities. And so just as a token of appreciation, we want to present you with this certificate to recognize the work that you're doing and for your participation today. So the International Indigenous Women's Forum, International Women's Global Leadership School, in recognition to Fatima Gurung, for participation and contribution in the capacity building of Indigenous women leaders from Africa, Asia, Latin America, North America, and the Pacific during the 10th edition of the Program on Human Rights and International Advocacy Skills with Gratitude on this virtual modality. It's signed by the Executive Director of FIMI, Teresa Zapeta. So we will be sharing this with you also in email. Pratima, and we hope that we can meet one time in person with all the others. Yes. So thank you so much, Pratima. We wish you all the best, and we hope to see you again in during the Global Leadership School or in person. We look forward to that. Thank you so much, and all the best.
Thank you for your time, and thank you for such a incredible recognitions that FIMI has given to me and to my community. I'm very much honored to represent 28 million Indigenous women with disability. And it's a really honor for my community, and it's not only for Nepal, it's a pride for the whole, Indigenous women with disabilities living across the world. So thank you, FIMI, and thank you, Winnie, for your wonderful facilitation. Thank you.
Thank you, Pratima. Thank you so much. And so I'll pass it over to Joy for a few announcements before we can close for the day. Joy, please.
Thank you so much, Winnie. So before we close, sisters, I have about four announcements to make. The first one that I've been informed to inform everyone is that this coming Wednesday, the 5th of April, we will not be having an online class. However, we will be giving this day to all of you to work on your regional statements, to finalize it, submit it to the nominated person to the drafting committee, and the drafting committee will be working on the global statement. So we will not be meeting online on the 5th of April, but we will be using this time to meet through WhatsApp maybe, or if you would like to have a Zoom call with any of your teammates in the drafting committee of the global statement to work on your global statement. For the other sisters who are not part of the drafting committee, kindly please use the 5th of April to work on your advocacy plans. If you look at the calendar, you will notice that we are already on the 3rd module, and the 10th of April will be our final day for the 3rd module. So that will leave us with just the 4th module, wherein we will be having 3 classes for the 4th module with Joanne Carling, Professor Elsa, and Professor Pamela from Columbia University. And then we will quickly be approaching towards the end of the module, which is module 5, where you will be having a session, just one session on during this time, but about 2 days of presentations of your advocacy plans. So please use the 5th of April to work on your advocacy plans. Send the drafts to your AA so that they can give you comments, give you inputs on how to make it better, along with your PPTs. So you will have a written Word document of your advocacy plan and a brief PPT for your presentation on the 5th module, which is on the 1st and the 3rd of May, where you will be presenting your advocacy plans. At this time, you will be given about 8 minutes each to present your plans. So when you make your PPT, please keep in mind to only highlight very important points that you would want to highlight at that particular moment for the expert who will come and give comments on your advocacy plan. So when your AAs read your advocacy plans, they'll give you inputs. Please work on those inputs and make it a final submission, so that we can also send it to the expert who will be coming to give inputs on your advocacy plans beforehand. So for example, if you will be presenting on the 1st of May, we expect you to send us your advocacy plans at least on the 3rd week of April, so that your AAs can finalize this with you, and we can also send this to the expert who will read your advocacy plans before they come and give you the inputs through your presentations on the main day. So that is the first announcement. The second announcement is that I hope you all have the link to the reading materials, the drive that I've created and I've shared with all of you at the beginning of the school on the various reading materials and also the bibliographies from Columbia University and the PPTs of every expert. So today I uploaded all the PPTs of last week, and also you will find a Word document in that drive where I've given you direct links to some readings that have been shared on the Zoom chat by the various professors. Today, Professor Elsa also shared two important readings that she would like for all of you to see. Actually, two important materials. One is a written document and another is a film on community mapping that she had taken on Friday. So please also have a look at that. And also, please remember that all of this particular drive and all the drives that I've shared with you in the school will be deactivated the minute the school is over. So let's say we have our closing ceremony on the 5th of May. You will just have about 1 week where I will still be opening these links. So I encourage you to please download your written documents and your PPTs from this drive now, so that you will have all of these materials for your future reference and you will not lose out on them. So again, please start downloading all of these. The materials so far, the PPT so far given by the experts have also been translated to Spanish, and the ones in Spanish have been translated to English. So please do not miss out on this. Please download your reading materials as well. So yes, so I would just like to again restate that the 5th of April, we will not be meeting online, but kindly use your time for working on the global statement and your advocacy plans. And we will see you again on the 10th of April. So we'll have 2 days gap this week, the 5th of April and the 7th of April, which is a Good Friday. And we will meet again on the 10th of April for a class by Teresa Zapeta and Tapio, who will be giving us the various recommendations concerning Indigenous women and using a particular Yanapak platform to track these recommendations. So 10th of April at 6 a.m. Guatemala time, we will see you again. So thank you so much, sisters. Please be in touch with your AAs, be in touch with your teammates who are drafting the global statement. And yes, have a good week ahead, and we will see you on the 10th of April. Thank you.
Thank you. Bye bye.